Before today's episode even begins, there's something you should know about our guest. Her career never once stayed inside the lines.
I'm a former chemist turned executive search firm owner. Sometimes that does throw people off. They are like, wait, executive what now?
Nileena Woodland is the founder and CEO of Elemental Hire, a recruiting firm operating at the intersection of science, technology, and human insight.
I think we've all heard AI. It's just a word that's being thrown around left and right. Something that I've heard from some HR folks where they got to a point where they were interviewing a candidate only to find out that candidate was not real and was an AI chatbot.
But her journey there didn't start in recruiting. It began inside a leading scientific instruments company, then shifted into IT, then into business analysis and consulting, before she decided to build something of her own. Today on KlikTV, we're sitting down with Nileena Woodland, founder and CEO of Elemental Hire, a recruiting firm that connects top talent with leaders in the analytical instruments industry. Nileena's path has been anything but traditional. She started her career as a product specialist at top scientific instruments company, Shimadzu, and then moved into IT and worked as a business analyst and even did some consulting before launching her own company. That mix of science, technology, and people skills gives her a unique perspective on how to build stronger teams in a highly specialized field. In today's conversation, we'll talk about how she leverages her diverse background to run a different kind of recruiting firm, how technology is reshaping the hiring process, and what skills early career scientists should focus on to grow into tomorrow's leaders. Then we'll wrap things up with a few rapid-fire questions to learn more about the person behind the brand. Nileena, thank you for being here. It's a pleasure to have you here.
Absolutely.
You've had such a unique career path, from lab to tech to entrepreneurship. When you meet someone new, how do you usually describe what you do today?
Well, it's kind of depends on how much time I have to explain to them what I've done in my career. But no, I usually start off just saying, hey, I'm a former chemist turned executive search firm owner. And sometimes that does throw people off. They are like, wait, executive what now? And then I have to say, oh, I own a recruitment firm. And then I jump into, I recruit specifically in the analytical instrument space because that's where my career kind of started off. And I get to explain to them, you know, I have a unique perspective in terms of understanding what they're looking for at the scientific instrument companies. So I think that goes a long way.
So most recruiters come from HR backgrounds, but you come from the lab and IT. So how does that difference show up in the way you run Elemental Hire?
You know, I think for recruiters, yes, some of them do work for either the companies that I'm recruiting for. So they have a human resources department, and sometimes they'll have like a talent acquisition person who's probably the closest thing to what I do. But the challenge there is that talent acquisition person's looking for people from somebody in their IT department to troubleshoot, you know, laptop issues, all the way up to potentially their VP of sales or a regional sales manager. So that's a lot, right, to ask somebody to be an expert in. Versus when a firm comes to me, I say, you know, I'm specialized in specifically the technology and the instrumentation that you sell. And I don't want to say I know every scientific instrument out there, but I've had a wide breadth and exposure working for almost 15 years for these types of companies. So that is, like I said, gives me that unique perspective in terms of, you know, I know what a product manager needs, what skill set they need to have, what sort of background will make them successful in a position. I know what a field application scientist should do or what skill set they need to have. And then if customers, meaning the clients or the hiring managers, get really technical and say, you know, I need somebody who has experience with liquid chromatography, mass spec. I know what they're talking about, right?
Okay.
Beyond just like that buzzword on someone's resume. So I think that's where, you know, I bring that unique combination of technical expertise, but then also the recruitment aspect, which is I know what you're looking for. I know the type of people to look for, versus, the recruiters, you know, I'd say the ones that I know that do it very well have a very similar story to mine, where they can say, I've worked in the industry that I recruit for, because I think that really is the challenge that a recruiter just off the street who says I have a laptop and a phone and I can work from my parents' basement. They just don't know. They don't have that market mastery.
Yeah.
Versus someone who's worked in the industry, kind of speaks the language, understands the pain points of that particular hiring manager. They can really dig in deep beyond just looking for buzzwords on a resume.
So, Nileena, how are you using technology to enhance rather than to replace the human side of recruiting?
I think we've all heard AI, right? It's just a word that's being thrown around left and right for the last couple of years, but reality is AI has been around for ages, in some capacity or the other. I still very much believe in the human component and the human relationship, because that's what builds trust with the hiring manager or with a client or with somebody in human resources to say, you're going to pay me money to find the best talent out there for you. And that's not something that can just happen through an email or, through newsletters or even just one phone call. That's something that has to be...
You need to feel that person's energy and understand what their personality is like.
And you have to nurture it, right?
Yeah.
When it comes down to the brass and tacks of recruitment, phone is still kind of king. And I recruit across the entire country, right? So I'm based here in Maryland, but I can call somebody in California, I can call somebody in Oregon, and I won't necessarily get to see them in person unless we happen to be at the same trade show.
Right.
So a lot of that is email, LinkedIn message, but then also picking up the phone and you can hear my voice, or doing a video conference over Teams so they can see my face, because that's something that I've heard from some HR folks where they got to a point where they were interviewing a candidate only to find out that candidate was not real and was an AI chatbot.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah. I mean, and can you imagine handing over any sort of sensitive information, even like a laptop or a company car, something that person who's behind that chatbot could then use to cause some serious
harm. That's why cybersecurity is so important.
Yes, friends. But I think, again, for myself and the recruiters that I know who are using AI and using automation, it's really to make their lives easier. It's like, okay, I have a resume. How can I summarize it, put my logo on it, make it nice and clean to then send to a client? How can it help me, make a nice presentation for my client? Those of us that know what it takes to be successful in recruitment understand that it's relationships, understand that there has to be the human component, and we can't lose sight of that. The resumes on the flip side, from a client's perspective, candidates can now hire, I think, AI bots to just apply to jobs automatically without ever looking at them, without even knowing if they're qualified for them.
Yeah.
And companies are getting those resumes. And it's like, well, again, that one talent acquisition person, do they have the bandwidth to sift through 200 resumes, more than half of which could just be an AI bot, right? So we can't lose, and I feel very strongly about that. We just can't lose the human component and the human element to recruitment, because that's still very, very important in building that trust and nurturing the relationship.
So for young scientists that are just starting out, what skills matter most for long-term success?
In today's marketplace, it's very challenging. I think everyone can agree, especially in the sciences, with research funding is being cut, and a lot of the organizations that typically hire fresh out of college or even PhD students are being cut. Budgets are tight, which then trickles down to these scientific instrument companies. So the biggest advice I can give to them is, yes, know your space, know whatever area you've gone into, whether it's biotech or life sciences or biochemistry, but then you have to be willing to be resilient. I think that's number one skill set that doesn't always get taught, I would say. And even I can speak to, I have very young children, and that's something that they're having in their first and second grade classes, talking about resilience.
Wow.
Because I think that is something that you have to build, right? Yeah. COVID showed that to us when we all were locked down. When people were making career changes and having to bounce from, point A to point B. But I think the resilience piece, and then kind of think outside the box, because I think as scientists, and I've talked to other fellow scientists who say the same thing, where we kind of get boxed in terms of either it's you go into teaching if you pursue a higher degree after your bachelor's. So if you do a master's or a PhD, or you're looking to go into research. And there's a lot of in between those two career options. So I would say, we talked about network. I would say network like hell, even in high school, even in college, even if you think like, I know my career path, I know exactly what I'm going to do, because I was that person. I thought I knew exactly what I was going to do. And then look, I've taken so many left turns and pivots, but everything that I've done has taught me a valuable skill. And I think that's important, that you do learn something from, even things that might be considered failures or things that you thought you weren't as successful at. But that's where that resilience piece comes into play. It's like, okay, this didn't work, so how can I pivot? But how can I use the skill sets that I got from, job A to now apply them to something else?
Okay, well, that's all the questions I have for you today.
Right.
Thank you so much for being here.
I appreciate you taking the time to talk to me. And like I said, just, it's a challenging marketplace. So I guess for my candidates out there who are looking for jobs, both actively and passively, get with good recruiters. And I know sometimes it's hard to find them because there are, again, a dime a dozen. And there's unfortunately a lot of bad actors out there. Who call themselves recruiters, but get with good recruiters. And again, just network. And, I am seeing a slight shift in people getting hired. So there is hope out there, but I know, when you're in the thick of it, it doesn't feel like there's hope, but there is hope out there. So